The storm didn't arrive with thunder. It arrived quietly, in the middle of the night, while people were sleeping and trusting walls that had never been tested. By morning, roofs had collapsed, heat was gone, children were crying in the cold, animals were trembling with nowhere to hide. Most homes failed exactly when they were needed most. But one unfinished stone house, built by a quiet cowboy no one paid attention to, was still standing. And when the wind came back stronger, people started knocking on his door. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. And if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Winter did not arrive suddenly in Sheridan, Wyoming. It settled in gradually, tightening the town day by day. First the mornings grew colder, then the afternoons lost their warmth earlier than expected. By the time people noticed, the cold was already established, sitting low over the land and waiting. Sheridan lay at the base of the Bighorn Mountains, where weather traveled long distances without obstruction. Wind had space to build speed, and snow had nowhere to rest except where it was forced. South of town, Cottonwood Hollow stretched open and exposed. It was a shallow valley with little natural protection, no tree line thick enough to break the wind, no rise in the land to slow it. Houses there faced winter directly. Most had been built quickly, framed in light timber, raised with the expectation that storms would be manageable. In summer, they looked adequate. In winter, they revealed their weaknesses. Briar Kincaid noticed these weaknesses because he had learned to look for them. At 32, he was tall, lean, and physically strong without excess. His build came from long hours of work rather than training. His shoulders stayed relaxed, conserving effort. His face was angular, with a narrow scar along his chin from a fracture that had healed without medical care. His beard was kept short and uneven. His hair was dark brown, usually hidden beneath a worn hat. His eyes were gray-green and steady. He did not look away easily, but he also did not stare. When Briar examined something, it was with practical attention, not curiosity. People in Sheridan described him as quiet, not withdrawn, simply reserved. Briar spoke when there was a reason to speak and stopped when the point was made. He did not explain himself unless asked, and even then, he answered directly. He did not enjoy attention and did not seek agreement. His manner was calm with most people, firm when necessary, and indifferent to opinion. He worked as a cowboy and general ranch hand. Fence. Repair after storms. Winter feeding. Checking cattle lines in poor weather. Breaking young horses when conditions allowed. He took jobs that required patience rather than speed. Ranchers trusted him because he showed up on time and finished his work without complaint. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, and rarely went into town unless he needed supplies. Briar's caution had been learned early. When he was 17, his mother was caught in a sudden whiteout while driving home. Snow erased the road faster than expected. Wind pushed the truck off its line. The vehicle slid into a shallow ravine and became buried overnight. Briar was not with her. They found the truck the next morning. The event taught him something he never forgot. Weather does not give warnings, and familiarity does not provide protection. After that, Briar learned to prepare quietly. He rented a small room behind a feed store for years. He repaired his clothes and gear instead of replacing them. He cooked simple meals and saved what he earned. He treated money as something to be used carefully, not spent casually. When he had enough, he did not buy a house. He bought land. The plot sat on elevated ground in Cottonwood Hollow. Briar chose it for practical reasons. The soil drained well. The land lay above runoff paths. The wind passed over it instead of collecting. It offered no shelter, but it also offered no false security. Briar trusted that. The first truckload of stone arrived on a clear morning that felt colder than it looked. Briar drove the truck himself. The stone was local sandstone and fieldstone, heavy and irregular. He unloaded it alone, placing each piece deliberately instead of dumping them into a pile. He arranged them with purpose, already considering weight and alignment. His horse, Juniper, stood tied nearby. She was an older chestnut mare with a thickening winter coat. One ear was notched, and one eye carried a faint cloud from an old injury. She was calm and steady, shifting her weight only when necessary. Briar trusted her judgment. Animals noticed things before people did. As Briar worked, a few people slowed as they passed. Some made comments, others simply watched. He did not acknowledge them. He measured, leveled, and stacked stone, leaving narrow cavities between layers. These were not gaps. They were deliberate spaces designed to control air movement. Breyer was not building to trap heat completely. He was building to slow its loss. The first person to approach him directly was May 2 Rivers. She stopped at the edge of the lot and observed silently. Breyer set his stone down and waited. May was 72. She was small but upright, walking with a cane more out of habit than weakness. Her skin was darkened by years outdoors, deeply lined but even. Her white hair was braided neatly down her back. Her eyes were sharp and black, assessing without hostility. People in Sheridan respected her because she rarely spoke without reason. "You're using stone," she said. "Yes," Breyer replied. "That's not common here." "No." May studied the foundation lines and the stacked stone. "Winter doesn't hate people," she said. "It tests them." Breyer nodded. "That's why I'm building now." May tapped her cane lightly against the ground. "Don't build like you're fighting the wind," she said. "Build like you're listening to it." "I am," Breyer answered. May nodded once and walked away. By late afternoon, the temperature dropped sharply. Breyer finished his work for the day and stood inside the low outline of the foundation. Against the open land, it looked small, incomplete, but Breyer did not measure progress by appearance. He measured it by function. Juniper nudged his shoulder lightly. Breyer rested a gloved hand against her neck. The wind moved across Cottonwood Hollow, steady and persistent. Breyer listened to it without fear. He remembered the road that had disappeared years earlier and the lesson that followed. Preparation was not control, it was respect. As dusk settled, the stone foundation remained unchanged. Breyer turned toward his truck, already planning the next stage. Winter had not fully arrived yet, but when it did, he intended to be ready. Winter advanced without drama, the way pressure advances in the ground before a freeze. The mornings in Sheridan grew quieter, sound carried farther, sharper. Boots rang faintly on packed dirt, breath lingered longer in the air. Breyer Kincaid returned to Cottonwood Hollow before sunrise each day, the light still low and colorless, and worked until his hands stiffened enough to warn him to stop. He did not rush. He did not pause unnecessarily. The foundation from the previous week held its lines, and now he began to raise the first courses of stone, lifting weight carefully, setting each piece so gravity would do most of the work. The stone walls rose slowly to ankle height, then to knee, the mass changing the feel of the space almost immediately. Wind that skimmed freely across the hollow lost speed when it met the stone. Inside the low perimeter, the air settled. Breyer noticed this without comment, the way he noticed changes in a horse's gait before a stumble became a fall. He adjusted spacing, kept the cavities narrow and continuous, and checked alignment with a simple level he had carried since his first season on the range. Juniper stood nearby, tied to the same post, her winter coat thickening. She was patient, but not idle. When gusts came from the north, she angled her hindquarters instinctively, shielding her flank. Breyer trusted that behavior. He trusted animals that conserved energy. By midweek, the work had drawn attention beyond passing glances. A man named Thomas Reed rode out one afternoon and dismounted without speaking. Reed was 41, broad across the shoulders, thick through the neck, with hands marked by years of carpentry. His beard was dark and trimmed close, his hairline receding in a way that suggested he had stopped worrying about appearances some time ago. He wore a heavy canvas coat and boots scarred at the toes. Reed had a reputation for finishing jobs efficiently and charging fairly. He did not linger when something failed. His standards. He walked the perimeter slowly, eyes tracing lines, boot toe tapping lightly at the base stones. Breyer waited. When Reed finally spoke, it was without humor. "You're stacking heavy," he said. "Yes," Breyer replied. "And leaving air." "Yes." Reed crouched, peering into one of the narrow cavities. "Most folks seal everything tight. Most folks lose heat fast," Breyer said. Reed stood and wiped his hands on his coat. He studied Breyer's face, the lack of defensiveness, the absence of explanation beyond what was asked. "Stone holds cold," Reed said, not as a challenge but as a statement. "It also slows change," Breyer answered. Reed considered that, nodded once and mounted his horse. He did not offer help. He did not offer warning. He rode away thinking, which was more than Breyer expected. The next visitor arrived 2 days later, nearer dusk, when the temperature dropped abruptly and shadows stretched across the hollow. Eldon. Mercer came on horseback, his chestnut gelding stepping carefully over frozen ruts. Mercer was 54, broad-chested, thick-armed, with a beard threaded heavily with gray and a posture shaped by decades of building. His hands were large and scarred, clean despite the work. He carried himself with authority that came from experience rather than volume. Mercer dismounted and surveyed the walls in silence, his eyes moving with practiced efficiency. He did not rush his assessment. Breyer recognized the look. It was the look of a man counting potential failures before acknowledging any success. "You're committed," Mercer said at last. "I am," Breyer replied. Mercer stepped closer, boots scraping lightly against frozen dirt. "Stone's unforgiving," he said. "It doesn't flex. It doesn't warn you before it fails." "That's why I'm not asking it to flex," Breyer said. "I'm asking it to carry." Mercer's mouth tightened slightly. He examined the spacing, the way the courses overlapped, the depth of the foundation. "You planning to heat it like a furnace?" he asked. "No," Mercer snorted. "Then you'll freeze." Breyer did not argue. He had learned long ago that arguments rarely changed weather or men who had already decided. "I plan to slow the loss," he said. Mercer studied him again, longer this time. "Winter here doesn't care about plans," he said. "I know us," Breyer replied. "That's why I started early." Mercer mounted his horse, shook his head once, and rode off. He did not say he approved. He did not say he would interfere. His silence carried weight either way. The work continued. The walls reached mid-calf, then thigh height. The stone mass altered the microclimate inside the perimeter more noticeably now. Breyer tested it deliberately, standing within the structure as wind swept the hollow. Outside, gusts cut sharply. Inside, the air moved but slower. Predictably, he noted where drift collected and adjusted the outer edge of the stone accordingly. It was during this stage that Breyer accepted help for the first time. Eli Sutter arrived on foot with a dog trotting beside him. Sutter was 39, tall and narrow, with a long face and a beard that grew in uneven patches, giving him a perpetually tired appearance. His hair was light brown and rarely combed, and his eyes were restless, observant. He carried a short mason's hammer and a brass level worn smooth at the edges. Sutter had apprenticed under Mercer years earlier and left after a dispute over credit and pay. Since then, he took smaller jobs and moved often. "You're building something strange," Sutter said, stopping a few steps back. "Strange survives," Breyer replied. Sutter crouched and ran his fingers along a joint. "You're leaving air on purpose." "Yes." Sutter straightened slowly. "My grandfather built like this," he said. "Old country methods. Stone outside, air is moving slow between. Folks stopped because it took longer." "Can you work?" Breyer asked. "For fair pay," Sutter said. "You'll get it," Breyer replied. Sutter nodded. He tied his dog to a stake and set down his tools. The dog, Maple, was an older black and white cattle mix, 8 or 9 years old, with a noticeable limp in her left hind leg and a scar across her muzzle. Her eyes were sharp, assessing. She lay down near the stone, choosing a spot where wind was already less aggressive. Breyer noticed and approved. Animals chose honestly. They worked in tandem after that. Sutter shaped and fitted. Breyer placed and checked alignment. Conversation stayed practical. Measurements, load paths, timing. Sutter moved quickly but did not rush. He complained once about the cold and then stopped, the way men do when complaint proves useless. As the walls rose to knee height, the space inside became distinctly different from the land around it. Wind lost its edge crossing the cut. Stone. Sound softened. Breyer lit a small fire one evening to test air movement, watching how heat rose and lingered before drifting toward the vents. It moved slowly. That mattered. Another presence joined the edge of the site late one afternoon. June Halstead stood watching from a distance before approaching. She was 39, of average height, with a slim build and posture that suggested discipline rather than fragility. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight braid, and her skin showed the dryness of long winters spent outdoors despite indoor work. She wore wire-framed glasses and a wool coat patched neatly at the elbows. June taught at the elementary school in Sheridan and was known for being practical, reserved, and unafraid of silence. "You're not building fast," she said. "No," Breyer replied. "My students' families live out here," she said. "They lose heat every winter." Breyer nodded. "I've noticed." June looked at the stone, then at this. Waste Maple had positioned herself against the wall. "Children feel cold before adults admit it," she said. She set a small bundle on a stone, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. For later. She did not linger. By the end of the week, the walls reached mid-thigh. The change inside the structure was undeniable. Briar slept there one night, wrapped in blankets, fire minimal. The temperature dropped hard after sunset. Outside, frost formed thick and fast. Inside, the cold arrived more slowly. Briar woke before dawn and took note, not comfortable, but controlled. May 2 Rivers returned the next afternoon. She stepped inside the perimeter, closed her eyes briefly and nodded. "It's listening," she said. That night, the wind strengthened. Fences down the hollow rattled. Somewhere to the east, a loose shed roof failed with a sharp crack that carried in the cold air. Briar and Sutter stood back, watching. The stone did not move. The cavities whispered softly as air passed through. Sutter exhaled. "It's holding," he said. "Yes," Briar replied. "So far." Winter had not yet made its demand, but it was learning the shape of the walls. By the second week of November, Winter and Sheridan stopped circling and began to lean in. The cold no longer tested lightly. It pressed, nights dropped faster, and the ground rang faintly beneath boots by mid-morning. Frost no longer retreated when the sun rose. It waited, thin and patient, clinging to shadowed ground and unfinished work. Briar Kincaid adjusted without comment. He arrived earlier, worked more deliberately, and paid closer attention to how the stone answered the changes around it. The walls had reached waist height, thick enough now to register weight rather than suggestion. Inside the structure, the air behaved differently. Wind still entered, but it no longer rushed. It slowed, turned, and passed through the cavities the way water follows a channel it did not choose but must respect. Briar tested this carefully. He stood still during gusts, listening not to volume but to pattern. Outside, the wind cut hard across Cottonwood Hollow. Inside, it moved with restraint. Eli Sutter worked beside him each day, his movements efficient, practiced. The lines in Eli's face had deepened with the cold, his beard growing heavier and more uneven as trimming lost priority. He had the look of a man who had spent too many winters adapting to other people's plans. Here, he followed Briar's lead without resistance, partly because the structure made sense and partly because it behaved the way Briar said it would. Men like Eli trusted results over reputation. Maple, his old cattle dog, claimed a permanent place against the inner wall. Her black and white coat had grown coarse with age, her limp more pronounced when the ground froze. She moved slowly now, but she paid attention. When the wind shifted, she repositioned without instruction, choosing the lee side instinctively. Briar watched this and adjusted stone placement where she favored resting. Animals marked success honestly. As the walls rose, Briar began planning the roof supports. This stage mattered. More than any other. Stone could carry weight, but only if the load was distributed correctly. He selected timber sparingly, hauling dense beams cut months earlier and left to season properly. They were not decorative. They were functional. Each beam was measured, placed, and seated into stone pockets carved by Eli with patient precision. It was during this work that Silas Crow arrived. He came on foot, leaning heavily on a hickory cane polished smooth by years of use. Silas was 61, tall but bent forward at the shoulders, his frame thinned by an old injury that had never healed cleanly. His beard was long and iron gray, left untrimmed not from neglect but indifference. His eyes were pale and sharp, set deep beneath heavy brows, constantly measuring distance and alignment. Silas had once been a surveyor before a fall from a horse shattered his hip and ended his career. Since then, he walked slowly and observed carefully. "You're transferring load outward," Silas said, without greeting, watching Eli seat a beam. "Yes," Briar replied. Silas nodded. "Most houses fail because weight doesn't know where to go." He tapped the ground with his cane, sketching a rough diagram in the dirt. "Roofs collapse when they're built like lids instead of frames." Eli straightened, interested. "And this one?" Silas studied the grid of beams, the depth of the walls, the overlap of stone. "This one wants to behave like a spine," he said. "Weight flows, doesn't pile." Briar accepted that assessment without pride. Silas stayed briefly, returning twice more over the next few days. Each time he pointed out something small, a place water might pool, an angle where wind shear could build. Breyer adjusted accordingly. When Silas stopped coming, Breyer took it as approval. The weather escalated quickly after that. Snow arrived in short bursts, light but frequent, enough to reveal weaknesses in lesser structures. Sheds sagged, roof lines complained. One afternoon, a shallow-roofed barn east of the hollow failed under a sudden accumulation, boards snapping with a sound that carried across the flats. Breyer paused his work and watched the direction of the wind. He didn't need to see the damage to understand it. June Halstead returned late that same day. She approached quietly, her steps careful on frozen ground. She wore the same wool coat, glasses fogging slightly in the cold. Her expression was composed, but there was tension beneath it. "One of my students' families lost a roof beam," she said. "No injuries, but they're scared." Breyer nodded. "Winter's still early." June looked at the walls, then at the roof supports. "They build fast," she said. "They always have." Breyer didn't respond. He had learned not to argue with facts that spoke for themselves. That night, the temperature dropped sharply, more than expected. Breyer and Eli secured the site and stepped back. Breyer chose to sleep inside again. Fire minimal, to test behavior under stress. He noted how the stone absorbed cold slowly, how the cavities moderated airflow. He woke once to check the beams, then slept again. In the morning, the interior was cold but stable. Outside, frost had hardened thick enough to ring underfoot. Word traveled. Eldon Mercer returned, this time without his horse. He walked the final stretch, boots crusted with ice, beard stiff with frost. He said nothing at first, simply stood inside the structure and watched how breath moved. "You've passed the point where this fails quietly," Mercer said, eventually. "Yes," Breyer replied. "If it fails now, it'll fail all at once." "Yes," Mercer looked at him. "You comfortable with that?" "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." Mercer studied the beams again, his skepticism thinning into something closer to calculation. He did not offer help, but he did not leave immediately either. The next storm arrived. 3 days later, stronger than the others. Wind came first, sustained and deliberate. Snow followed, dry and insistent, driven hard enough to sting exposed skin. Breyer and Eli secured what they could and retreated inside. Maple settled against the wall, unmoving. Elsewhere in Cottonwood Hollow, structures failed incrementally. A shed roof peeled back. A fence collapsed. Heat drained quickly from poorly sealed houses, and families burned fuel faster than planned. By evening, the sound of damage carried across the land. A man arrived just before dark. His name was Peter Rusk, late 20s, broad-faced, earnest, known more for strength than judgment. His beard was light and uneven, his coat too thin for the conditions. He had been sent to check cattle and turned back too late. "I heard your walls were holding," he said, breath coming hard. "Mind if I wait this out?" Breyer opened the door wider. "Come in." Peter stood inside, visibly surprised by the quiet. "It's different," he said. "Yes," Breyer replied. "Sit." Not long after, another arrived. Miriam Holt, 42, school administrator, narrow-framed, severe posture softened by exhaustion. Her glasses were fogged and her hands shook slightly from cold. "My stove won't draw," she said. "Smoke's filling the room." "Stay," Breyer said. They did not advertise. They did not need to. The storm carried the message. By midnight, 8 people occupied the unfinished house. They sat on crates wrapped in coats and blankets, sharing heat and silence. Eli monitored the beams hourly. Breyer listened to the structure, noting sound and vibration. The stone whispered but did not shift. Outside, wind pressed hard. Snow piled against lesser walls. Somewhere nearby, a roof beam failed with a sharp report. No one spoke. The sound explained itself. Mercer stayed awake, watching the structure, his certainty quietly revising itself. By morning, the storm eased. The land lay altered. Drifts filled roads. Rooflines sagged. People emerged cautiously, counting damage. Breyer stepped outside and surveyed the scene. The walls stood unchanged. The beams held. The cavities remained clear. Winter had made its first real demand. The structure had answered. The morning after the storm did not feel like relief. It felt like accounting. Cottonwood Hollow lay altered beneath a thin, hard crust of snow that no longer melted when the sun rose. Sound carried farther now. A hammer strike echoed. A cough traveled. Damage announced itself quietly, not all at once, but in details that could not be ignored. Briar Kincaid stepped outside the unfinished house and surveyed the land with the same measured attention he brought to stone and timber. He didn't look for proof of success. He looked for failure. He found none in the structure behind him. Inside, the air still held traces of the night, breath, smoke, the faint warmth of bodies that had shared space without crowding. Eli Sutter moved first, rolling his shoulders and flexing his hands, testing stiffness before it became pain. His beard had iced overnight, giving him a rougher look than usual, and his eyes were rimmed red from lack of sleep, but his focus was intact. Maple lay against the inner wall where she had chosen to sleep, her muzzle resting on her paws, ears alert. When Briar shifted his weight, she lifted her head briefly, then settled again. That quiet trust mattered. Peter Rusk emerged last, pulling on his coat with the awkwardness of someone who had not slept deeply. In daylight, his youth showed more clearly. He was broad and strong, but his face still carried the open uncertainty of a man who had not yet learned how quickly conditions could turn against him. He stepped outside, took in the view, and whistled softly. "Didn't hear it fall apart," he said, half to himself. "No," Briar replied. "You would have." Peter nodded, rubbing his hands together. "My boss's place lost part of the roof," he said. "They were lucky it went when no one was under it." He hesitated, then added, "They won't be able to fix it until spring." Briar said nothing. He had already reached the same conclusion. Miriam Holt left shortly after sunrise. She was more composed in daylight, her posture straight again, but fatigue lingered in the set of her shoulders. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the walls. "It doesn't feel temporary," she said. "That matters." Then she left, moving carefully across the frozen ground. By mid-morning, people began to arrive, not all at once, and not with urgency. They came in pairs or alone, stopping at the edge of the lot as if uncertain whether they were welcome. Briar did not wave them in. He did not turn them away. He continued working, setting stone, checking the beams, clearing vents of fine ice. The house spoke for itself. Thomas Reed returned first, dismounting near the foundation and standing with his hands in his coat pockets. He had a different look now, less evaluative, more practical. He walked the perimeter again, slower than before, noting where snow had collected and where it had not. "Walls held," he said. "Yes," Briar answered. Reed nodded. "People are asking why." Briar lifted a beam slightly, seated it, and stepped back. "They should ask their houses." Reed almost smiled. He did not offer help, but he did not leave immediately either. Eldon Mercer arrived later that afternoon. He came on horseback this time, his chestnut gelding moving stiffly in the cold. Mercer dismounted and stood for a long moment without speaking. His beard was trimmed again, but the gray stood out more sharply, as if winter had accelerated something already underway. He walked inside the structure, removed his gloves, and held them loosely in his hands. "I watched houses fail last night," Mercer said. "Not all at once, one mistake at a time." He looked up at the beams. "Most men blame the storm." "And you?" Briar asked. Mercer exhaled slowly. "I blame habits." He looked at Briar. "You didn't build out of habit." "No," Briar said. Mercer nodded. He did not apologize. He didn't praise. He asked questions. Instead, about spacing, about beam placement, about why the cavities ran continuous instead of segmented. Briar answered plainly. Mercer listened. As the day wore on, Eli noticed something Briar had already suspected. People were not just observing. They were measuring the space against their own losses. June Halstead arrived again, this time with a man Briar had not seen before. She introduced him quietly. "This is Aaron Wells," she said. "He lives 2 lots over." Aaron was in his mid-40s, tall but stooped slightly, as if accustomed to ducking under beams that had never quite been high enough. His beard was thick and reddish, untrimmed, his hair thinning at the crown. His hands shook faintly, not from cold but from a restlessness he had not learned to hide. "My house didn't fall," Aaron said. "But it might as well have. We can't keep heat in. My youngest slept in her coat." Briar listened. Aaron did not ask for shelter. He asked for understanding. Briar showed him the walls, the cavities, the vents. He did not promise safety. He explained behavior. Aaron nodded slowly, absorbing information like a man memorizing a map he would need later. By late afternoon, another figure appeared at the edge of the lot, leading a mule. She introduced herself without hesitation. "Sarah Calloway," she said. "I heard people were staying here." Sarah was 32, medium height, spare rather than thin, with a straight-backed posture shaped by work rather than confidence. Her hair was the color of dark wheat, worn long and tied low. Wind and sun had roughened her skin, but her eyes were steady, hazel and clear. She wore a wool coat patched at the elbows, gloves worn thin at the fingers. The mule beside her, Ash, was older and gray, ribs faintly visible beneath a thickening coat, ears forward and patient. "I can cook," Sarah said. "I can organize. I won't get in the way." Briar studied her briefly, not suspicious, thorough. "Why?" he asked. Sarah did not hesitate. "Because winter doesn't stop at one storm," she said, "and people get careless when they think the worst has passed." Eli glanced at Briar. Maple lifted her head and watched Sarah closely. Briar nodded. "Stay," he said. Sarah proved useful immediately. She took inventory of supplies without making it obvious. She rearranged crates so foot traffic flowed better. She noticed where drafts formed near the door and adjusted hanging canvas accordingly. She spoke little and asked practical questions. The mule settled nearby without fuss. As dusk approached, wind rose again, not as violently as before, but persistent enough to remind everyone that winter had not finished. A family arrived just before dark, 2 adults and a child no older than 6. They had walked from a quarter-mile away after their stove cracked. Sarah met them at the door, guided them inside, and set them near the inner wall. The child fell asleep within minutes. That night, 11 people occupied the unfinished house. The fire burned low and steady. Briar monitored airflow and condensation, adjusting vents when necessary. Eli checked beams and joints. Mercer sat awake longer than anyone, watching the way heat moved through the space. He did not comment, but his silence had shifted. Outside, Cottonwood Hollow lay quiet under a pale moon. Damage would be addressed later. Tonight, the work was simply holding. Near midnight, Mercer spoke. "This isn't just a house," he said quietly. "It's an argument." Briar looked at him. "Against what?" "Against building like winter won't notice," Mercer said. Briar returned his attention to the fire. He had not built the house to argue. He had built it to stand. When morning came, the wind eased. People woke slowly, surprised by how rested they felt. Sarah served coffee from a dented pot. Maple moved among them, accepting brief pats before returning to her post. Ash stood, patiently outside, steam rising from his nostrils. As people left to check their homes, something had shifted. They did not leave with panic. They left with questions. Briar returned to work once the house emptied. He finished setting a beam and stepped back. The structure had not changed overnight, but its meaning had. It was no longer only his. Winter had not made its final demand yet, but it had revealed something else instead. Preparation, done quietly, had begun to spread. The cold returned the way it always did after people began to relax, quietly, without escalation, and with a patience that felt deliberate. Cottonwood Hollow settled into a stretch of days where the temperature did not rise above freezing and the wind shifted just enough to keep no one comfortable for long. Snow remained thin but constant, a dry skin over the ground that squeaked underfoot and hid ice where it pleased. Briar Kincaid noticed the change in patterns rather than degrees. The wind held direction longer. The air pressed instead of passing. These were not warnings, they were signs. Inside the unfinished house, the work changed. Construction continued, but it no longer occupied all of Briar's attention. The structure had begun to carry people as well as weight, and that demanded a different kind of care. Sarah Calloway moved through the space with quiet efficiency, setting routines without announcing them. She rose before most others, her movement steady, her posture straight even when tired. At 32, she carried herself with the economy of someone used to managing limited resources. Her hair, dark wheat and worn long, stayed tied back against her neck. Her skin showed the roughness of years outdoors, and her hands were strong, the knuckles thickened slightly from work. She did not speak much, but when she did, it was to clarify or correct, never to speculate. Eli Sutter adjusted easily to the shift. He still worked stone and timber when there was light, but he also took responsibility for the integrity of the interior at night. He checked beams, monitored condensation, and made small corrections before problems formed. His restlessness had softened into focus. He had stopped talking about moving on. Maple, his old dog, followed him closely now, her limp more pronounced on frozen ground. She slept lightly, lifting her head at unfamiliar sounds, then settling again when nothing followed. Juniper stood tethered just outside the lee side of the structure, snow dusting her mane. Briar brushed her longer each evening now, checking her legs carefully. She tolerated the attention with patience, her breath steady, her ears tracking wind shifts rather than voices. Animals adjusted faster than people when conditions changed. The next storm arrived without spectacle, no sudden drop in pressure, no dramatic snowfall at first. It came as weight. Wind leaned into the land and stayed there. Snow followed in fine grains that found every opening and tested every seam. By nightfall, roads into Cottonwood Hollow were no longer reliable. Briar and Eli secured the site early, reinforcing the doorframe and clearing the vents. Sarah reorganized sleeping arrangements, placing children and older adults closer to the inner wall where temperature change was slowest. People arrived steadily as darkness settled, not in panic, with calculation. A man named Henry Cole came first, leaning heavily on a cane. Henry was 52, stooped from years of lifting loads that should have been shared. His beard was unkempt and gray, his eyes darting more than necessary. He flinched at sudden sounds, a habit left over from a barn collapse 2 winters earlier that had trapped him briefly under debris. He stood just inside the doorway, scanning the ceiling before he relaxed enough to sit. Soon after came Ruth Alvarez and her husband Daniel, both under 30, their first child bundled tightly between them. Daniel was compact and broad-chested, his beard thick and black, his jaw clenched with effort to stay calm. Ruth was smaller, her dark hair braided tightly, her eyes sharp despite exhaustion. She did not sit until she had mapped the space. Sarah guided them to a spot away from drafts. The child slept. By midnight, the house held 19 people. The fire burned low and controlled. Briar monitored airflow, adjusting vents incrementally. He did not chase warmth, he chased balance. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind pressed hard, against lesser structures, stripping heat and confidence. Somewhere nearby, a roof failed with a sharp crack that cut through the night. A woman near the fire startled and gripped her coat. Sarah knelt beside her and placed a steady hand on her forearm until the tension eased. Eldon Mercer arrived just before dawn. He came on foot, his horse left where the road had become impassable. His beard was stiff with ice, his coat rimmed white. He looked older in the low light, not weaker, but stripped of assumption. He stepped inside and stood still, letting the warmth reach him slowly. "It's worse than last time," Mercer said quietly. "North Ridge lost 2 roofs. One collapsed outright." Briar nodded. "Anyone hurt?" "Not yet," Mercer said, "but they will be if this keeps up." They did not discuss options. There were none that mattered. The house held. That was the option. The second night tested endurance. Wind did not let up. Snow piled faster than anyone could. Clear elsewhere. Inside, the temperature dipped and steadied. Not comfortable. Not dangerous. People slept in shifts. Eli checked the beams hourly. Maple repositioned herself twice, choosing deeper shelter as pressure changed. Henry Cole slept for the first time since arriving, his breathing slow and even. A child developed a fever near morning. Sarah and Miriam Holt tended him quietly, using cool cloths and careful timing. Briar sat nearby, listening to the structure. Stone made its own sounds under stress, small shifts, murmurs that meant weight was settling as designed. Nothing cracked, nothing complained. When the wind finally broke on the 4th morning, it did not fade gradually. It stopped. Silence followed, deep and unsettling. People emerged slowly, blinking against the pale light. The land lay transformed. Drifts buried fences. Rooflines sagged or lay open. Roads were gone beneath sculpted snow. No one had died. That fact spread quickly, carried by those who walked out. Of Briar's doorway. Eldon Mercer stood outside longer than anyone, hat in hand, staring at the walls as if seeing them for the first time. "This wasn't luck," he said. "No," Briar replied. By afternoon, people returned with questions instead of fear. They asked about walls, about vents, about why heat lasted longer here. Briar answered plainly. He did not teach. He explained. Sarah organized supplies, tracked who needed what, and sent people home when it was safe. She didn't dramatize the work. She completed it. As evening approached, Mercer returned with 2 men. Thomas Reed came again, along with a younger builder named Owen Bishop. Owen was 26, lean, quick-eyed, his beard sparse and his movements restless. He listened more than he spoke, his attention drawn to details others skipped. "We want to try this," Mercer said. "Not copy it, understand it." Breyer nodded. "Then start with time," he said, "and stop pretending winter is temporary." They stood together in the cold light, not planning immediately, but recalibrating. The house behind them remained unchanged, its role no longer limited to shelter. It had become a measure. That night, after the last visitor left, Breyer walked the perimeter alone. Juniper shifted softly at his approach. Maple followed at a distance. The wind had settled, but winter remained. Breyer rested a hand against the stone and felt the stored warmth beneath the surface. He had built a house to endure weather. He had not expected it to endure people. Winter had stopped asking questions. Now it was listening. Winter did not loosen its grip after the long storm. It merely shifted its weight. The days that followed were clear and bitter, the kind of cold that settled into joints and tools alike. Snow remained packed hard against fences and buildings, sculpted by wind into shapes that suggested intention where there was none. Cottonwood Hollow moved carefully now. People walked slower. They listened before they spoke. Damage had been counted, but consequences were still unfolding. Breyer Kincaid returned to routine as soon as the house emptied. Routine steadied him, and it steadied others who watched. He cleared the vents again, checked the beams for any hairline movement, and adjusted the outer stone where drift had pressed hardest. The structure had not shifted, but Breyer never mistook survival for completion. Endurance required maintenance. Eldon Mercer came back the next morning, not alone. He brought Thomas Reed and Owen Bishop with him, along with a 4th man Breyer had not met before. Mercer introduced him briefly. "Caleb Monroe, works shear lines west of town." Caleb was 45, tall but narrow through the shoulders, his frame thinned by recent hardship rather than age. His beard was streaked with premature gray, trimmed unevenly, and his eyes carried a constant alertness that suggested sleep came lightly to him. A fall years earlier had left him with a stiff knee, and he favored it slightly when the ground was uneven. He listened more than he spoke. They stood inside the house while Mercer talked, not about admiration, about failure. He listed what he had seen during the storm, where roofs collapsed, where walls bowed, where heat vanished fastest. Reed added practical observations. Owen asked questions, precise and frequent, his quick mind working through implications faster than his hands could yet manage. Breyer answered when asked. He didn't present a system. He explained choices. Why stone mass mattered, why air needed to move, not rush, why load. Paths decided whether a roof failed gradually or all at once. He spoke plainly, avoiding theory where experience sufficed. "This isn't a trick," Breyer said. "It's time and attention." Caleb nodded slowly. "Time's cheaper than rebuilding," he said. By afternoon, word had spread that Mercer was walking sites with Breyer. People noticed that. In Cottonwood Hollow, reputation traveled faster than snowmelt. A few families arrived not seeking shelter, but advice. They stood back, respectful, waiting to be acknowledged. Breyer spoke to them one at a time, asking about their houses before offering any suggestion. He didn't promise fixes. He pointed out priorities. Sarah Calloway watched the change quietly. She had stayed on after the storm without discussion, sleeping lightly, keeping track of supplies and people. Her presence had become structural in its own way. At 32, she carried herself with calm efficiency, neither hurried nor passive. Her clothing remained practical, patched but clean. She had begun to anticipate needs before they were voiced. More water set aside, tools placed where hands reached for them, food portioned so nothing ran short unexpectedly. That evening she spoke to Breyer while he checked the door frame. "People are going to expect this place to keep holding," she said. "It will," Breyer replied, "but it can't be the only one." Sarah nodded. "Then you'll need help whether you want it or not." The next days confirmed that. Mercer began organizing crews to stabilize the most damaged houses before deeper cold set in. He worked differently now, slower, more deliberate. He asked Reed to oversee framing adjustments. Owen was assigned to measure and record rather than build, his role shifting toward understanding structure before shaping it. Breyer visited these sites when asked. He did not supervise. He observed and corrected small things, angles, spacing, vent placement, before they became large problems. Caleb Monroe joined him on several visits, his quiet presence steady. Caleb had lost part of his shearing operation during the storm when a shed collapsed, killing several sheep. The loss had not made him bitter. It had made him careful. "You start thinking about what fails when you're not there," Caleb said once, watching Reed reinforce a beam. "That changes how you build." Animals adjusted too. Juniper was moved closer to the house now, her shelter reinforced. Breyer noticed she stood calmer during wind, less prone to shifting. Maple followed Eli constantly, her limp slowing her but not diminishing her awareness. She alerted once in the night to a loose panel beginning to rattle before it could tear free. One afternoon brought a new visitor. Samuel Ortega arrived on a narrow sled pulled by a compact sorrel horse, whose coat was darkened with sweat despite the cold. Ortega was 43. Tall and spare, with sharp features and a carefully kept beard that suggested discipline rather than vanity. 3 fingers were missing from his left hand, the result of a rail accident years earlier. He spoke with precision and moved deliberately, his eyes constantly measuring slope and load. "I was sent to look," Ortega said simply. Breyer showed him the structure without embellishment. Ortega examined the stone, the cavities, the beams. He knelt to inspect vent placement, tapped the wall lightly, listened. When he stood, his expression had shifted. "This isn't innovation," Ortega said. "It's recovery. Someone remembered what was abandoned." He stayed the afternoon, sketching load paths in the snow with a stick, discussing drainage and wind shear with Mercer. The conversation remained technical, grounded. No one spoke about credit. That night, Breyer and Sarah shared a late meal near the fire after others had gone. The house was quieter now, but not empty. It held tools, plans, and expectation. Sarah wrapped her hands around a tin, cup and spoke without looking at him. "You didn't mean for this," she said. "No," Breyer replied. "But you didn't stop it." "No." She nodded. "That matters." Outside, the wind moved lightly, no longer pressing. Winter remained present, but it had shifted from force to condition. That distinction mattered. In the following week, 3 houses began reconstruction under Mercer's direction. None were stone like Breyer's, but all borrowed its principles. Thicker walls, controlled air, slower work. Owen documented everything, his youthful impatience redirected into careful observation. Loss still existed. Not everything could be saved, but panic did not return. One morning, as Breyer walked the perimeter of his house, he noticed something unexpected. People no longer stood at a distance. They approached directly, asked clearly, listened carefully. The house had changed how they spoke. Winter continued. It would for months yet. But the work had shifted from reaction to intention. Breyer rested his hand briefly against the stone wall and felt the retained warmth beneath its surface. He had built a structure to endure weather. Now it was helping people endure themselves. Winter settled into its long middle stretch, the part no one romanticized. The storms grew less dramatic but more persistent, arriving in measured intervals that denied recovery. Snow no longer surprised anyone. It accumulated, compacted, and stayed. The cold was steady now, a condition rather than an event. Cottonwood Hollow learned to live inside it. Work continued, but it had changed shape. Breyer Kincaid no longer worked alone at the edges of his own project. His days were divided between finishing the interior of the stone house and walking other sites where rebuilding had begun. He moved carefully between them, never hurrying, never lingering. He understood something others were only beginning to accept. Staying was work. Endurance required structure long after the urgency passed. Inside the stone house, the final interior elements took form. Breyer laid the floor himself, fitting thick planks into the shallow recess he had prepared earlier so cold could not creep up from below, unchecked. He built shelves directly into the stone walls, recessing them deep enough to take advantage of the mass. Nothing was decorative. Everything served weight, airflow, or heat retention. The house was no longer unfinished. It was simply incomplete in ways that did not matter. Sarah Calloway remained. Her presence had become assumed, not questioned. She organized food deliveries from families who insisted on contributing, kept records of who owed nothing and who needed more, and quietly redirected excess without letting pride interfere. At 32, she carried the calm authority of someone who had learned to manage loss without allowing it to define her. Her movements were efficient, her speech direct. She did not dramatize fatigue, though it showed sometimes in the stiffness of her shoulders at night. Eli Sutter stayed as well, though he still did not say the word stay. He took responsibility for maintenance, checking joints, clearing vents, adjusting temporary partitions. As weather shifted, his beard had gone fully untrimmed now, giving him a rougher appearance, but his work had never been cleaner. The restlessness that once defined him had quieted. Maple, his aging dog, remained close, her limp worsening as winter wore on. She slept longer now, rising only when needed, but her attention never dulled. Juniper showed her age more clearly too. Briar noticed it in the way she took longer to settle after wind gusts, in the stiffness of her hind legs on cold mornings. He adjusted her feed, brushed her carefully, and spoke to her more than before. Not sentimentally, practically. Animals that had carried you through work deserved acknowledgement. Rebuilding in Cottonwood Hollow progressed slowly. Eldon Mercer oversaw the work with a seriousness that surprised many who had known him for decades. He no longer pushed for speed, he pushed for correctness. Thomas Reed handled framing with methodical patience, his broad hands measuring twice before setting a beam. Owen Bishop recorded everything, his youthful energy redirected into observation and documentation. He asked fewer questions now, but better ones. Samuel Ortega remained nearby, advising when needed. He camped at the edge of town, his sorrel horse tethered carefully, his sled stacked with tools and rolled plans. Ortega spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with precision. His missing fingers slowed him physically but sharpened his thinking. He pointed out drainage issues others overlooked and adjusted roof pitches by degrees that made measurable differences. One afternoon, a new figure arrived from the northern road. His name was Mark Ellison. He was 48, tall and broad, with a heavy beard shot through with white and a face permanently set in a look of mild disapproval. His coat was expensive, but poorly suited for prolonged cold, and his boots were new enough to squeak. Mark represented the county housing board, though he avoided saying so directly. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. "I've been asked to assess what's happening out here," he said. Briar listened without comment. Ellison walked the perimeter, took notes, asked about cost, materials, scalability. His tone was professional but detached. He spoke of budgets and timelines, of standards and approvals. "This works on a small scale," Ellison said eventually, "but people won't wait months to build." "They waited years to fix what failed," Briar replied. Ellison frowned slightly. "Winter doesn't pause for philosophy." "No," Briar said, "but it punishes shortcuts." Ellison did not argue. He wrote something down and left before dusk, his presence leaving behind a thin tension that Sarah noticed immediately. "He's thinking about control," she said later. "Yes," Briar replied. "And you don't like that." "I don't mind oversight," Briar said. "I mind forgetting why we started." That night, a quieter emergency arrived. Henry Cole returned, agitated, his breathing shallow. A section of his temporary shelter had shifted, and the noise triggered the old panic he carried from the collapse years before. He paced the interior, eyes darting to the ceiling. Sarah approached him slowly, spoke to him firmly, and guided him to sit against the inner wall where the stone held steady. Briar showed him the beams again, explained load paths calmly. Henry's breathing slowed. He slept before midnight. The incident lingered. Sarah mentioned it to Briar the next morning. "People don't just need houses," she said. "They need to trust the ceiling." "Yes," Briar replied. He had learned that lesson long ago. As January deepened, supplies tightened. Fuel had to be rationed carefully. Food deliveries slowed as roads remained unreliable. Sarah adjusted portions quietly, never allowing scarcity to feel like punishment. People noticed and responded in kind. No one hoarded. No one complained openly. The structure of the house, physical and social, held. Then came the loss no one had planned for. Maple did not rise one morning. Eli found her curled against the inner wall, her breathing shallow, her body stiff with cold that had finally outpaced her age. She was at least 9, possibly older. He knelt beside her without speaking, one hand resting on her ribcage until it stilled completely. He remained there long after the house had woken. They buried her that afternoon on the lee side of the stone house where wind had never reached her. Briar placed a flat stone over the grave. No words were spoken. The dog had done her work without ceremony. That was enough. Eli changed after that, not dramatically. He grew quieter, more focused. He took fewer breaks. He slept less. Briar noticed and adjusted expectations accordingly, ensuring Eli did not work alone too long. Loss required structure as much as labor did. Late one evening, as snow fell lightly, Briar and Sarah sat near the fire. The house was quieter now, most people having returned to their own homes as repairs allowed. The stone walls held the day's warmth longer than before. "You could leave," Sarah said. "People would understand." "Yes," Briar replied, "but you won't." "No?" She nodded. "Why?" Briar considered the question carefully. "Because staying is what makes the work matter." Sarah accepted that without comment. Outside, Cottonwood Hollow lay still beneath the snow. Rebuilding continued. Winter remained, but the panic had not returned. The house stood, not as a refuge waiting for disaster, but as an anchor, something that held even when nothing pulled against it. February arrived without ceremony, the way winter did everything once it had settled in for good. The days grew marginally longer, but the cold did not retreat. It changed texture instead, less biting, more constant. Snow hardened into a crust that held weight until it didn't. The wind moved differently now, no longer aggressive, but watchful, as if assessing whether the land had learned anything worth remembering. Cottonwood Hollow moved with it. People no longer spoke about surviving winter, they spoke about getting through it intact. Briar Kincaid noticed the shift in tone before he noticed it in behavior. Conversations lasted longer, questions were more specific. Fear had thinned into caution, and caution, when handled well, became competence. He spent fewer hours explaining fundamentals and more time confirming decisions others had already made. That was how he knew something had changed. The stone house stood finished enough that no one called it unfinished anymore. Its floors were set, its shelves built into the walls, its door hung true and sealed properly. The cavities ran uninterrupted, vents clear and adjusted for the season. It was not warm in the way people romanticized warmth. It was steady. Inside, temperature changed slowly, predictably, and that predictability mattered more than comfort. Sarah Calloway had taken on a rhythm that matched the house. She managed supply rotations, tracked repairs across the hollow, and coordinated shared labor without ever claiming authority. People deferred to her naturally, not because she demanded it, but because she never wasted effort. Her face showed more lines now than it had in early winter, not from age, but from responsibility. She accepted that without resentment. Eli Sutter remained, quieter since Maple's death. He worked with focus that bordered on severity, keeping systems in order, catching problems before they developed. He didn't speak much about the dog. He didn't need to. Her absence shaped the way he moved, more deliberate, less restless. Loss had anchored him. Juniper remained steady through it all. She moved slower now, but she did not falter. Briar adjusted her workload carefully, giving her more rest and better shelter. He brushed her longer each evening, checking her joints, speaking softly. She leaned into his presence the way old animals do, not seeking reassurance, but acknowledging continuity. Reconstruction across Cottonwood Hollow reached a visible turning point in mid-February. 3 houses stood fully reinforced. 2 more were nearing completion. None matched Briar's house exactly, but all shared its logic. Thicker walls, controlled airflow, roofs pitched and framed to carry weight outward instead of down. Mercer oversaw the work with attention that bordered on reverence. He did not speak of his earlier doubts. He did not need to. Mark Ellison returned once more, this time with fewer papers and more questions. He looked less comfortable in the cold than ever, his coat still ill-suited, his boots still too new, but his posture had softened. He listened longer before speaking. "We've been running numbers," he said. "The county's interested." Briar nodded. "Interested in what?" "In standards," Ellison said. "In not paying for the same mistakes twice." Sarah watched him closely. Ellison's language remained administrative, but his eyes were less detached now. He had seen the cost of abstraction. "You'll need to formalize some of this," Ellison continued. Guidelines, training. Not everything that matters fits into a form, Breyer said. Ellison smiled faintly. I'm learning that. They did not argue. They didn't agree fully either. That was acceptable. Late that week brought the last storm of consequence. It was not as violent as the earlier ones, but it was colder, its snow finer and more persistent. The wind returned briefly to test what had been built since it last spoke. Loudly, the houses held. No one fled in the night. No roofs failed. Fires burned steadily. Children slept. That mattered. After the storm passed, something unexpected happened. People stopped coming to the stone house at night, not because it was less safe, but because they no longer needed it. Repairs had reached a point where confidence had returned. The house remained open, but it was no longer crowded. Breyer noticed the quiet first, the echo of fewer footsteps, the way the fire lasted longer without tending. He didn't miss the noise. He took it as confirmation. One evening, as daylight lingered a few minutes longer than before, Breyer walked the perimeter with Sarah. The snow had begun to recede in patches, revealing dark soil beneath. It was not spring, but it was direction. They'll remember this, Sarah said. Yes, Breyer replied. For a while. Yes. She stopped walking and looked at him. And you? Breyer considered the question carefully. He looked at the house, at the hollow beyond, at juniper grazing slowly where the ground had begun to soften. I don't build for memory, he said. I build so people don't have to remember the hard way. Sarah nodded. That answer satisfied her. The next morning, Samuel Ortega packed his sled. He had stayed longer than intended, advised more than required. Before leaving, he walked the interior of the stone house one last time, resting his hand briefly against the wall. This will outlast us, he said. Breyer shrugged. That's the point. Eldon Mercer came by later, alone. He stood with Breyer near the door, both men watching the land. I've been building houses for 30 years, Mercer said. I thought experience meant certainty. He paused. Turns out it just means responsibility. Breyer nodded. He had learned the same lesson earlier, at a higher cost. As February edged toward March, life in Cottonwood Hollow settled into something close to normal. Work continued. Repairs finished. Plans formed for the coming seasons. No one spoke of miracles. They spoke of methods. One afternoon, Breyer overheard a child pointing at the stone house and asking her mother why it looked different. The mother answered simply, because someone paid attention. That was enough. On the final night of the chapter, the wind moved gently across the hollow, no longer pressing, no longer testing. Breyer sat inside the house with Sarah, sharing a quiet meal. The fire burned low. The walls held the day's warmth. You could go back to writing full time, Sarah said. Yes, Breyer replied, but you won't. No, she smiled slightly. Good. Outside, winter still held the land, but its grip had loosened. The house stood unchanged, not as a monument, but as a measure. It did not demand belief. It simply remained, and in remaining, it taught something simple and difficult. Storms were inevitable, but unpreparedness was not. Sometimes we expect miracles to arrive loudly, with thunder, with signs in the sky, with answers that come all at once. But most of the time, God works quietly, through patience, through preparation, through ordinary people who choose to do the right thing long before anyone is watching. That stone house did not stand because it was perfect. It stood because someone built it with care, humility, and respect for forces greater than himself, and in doing so, he became shelter for others without ever setting out to be a hero. In our own lives, storms will come, illness, loss, loneliness, fear that arrives in the middle of the night without warning. And when they do, we may not have control over the storm, but we do have control over what we build inside our hearts and our homes. Sometimes the miracle is not that the storm passes. The miracle is that God places strength among us so we can endure it together, through kindness, through wisdom, through people who refuse to turn away. If this story reminded you that God still sees the forgotten, that no child and no animal should ever face fear alone, then share this story with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from so we can pray for one another across distance and time. And if you believe that quiet faith still matters, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories that restore trust, courage, and compassion. May God bless you. May He protect your home, steady your heart, and keep you warm through every storm ahead. Amen.